Welcome everyone, bienvenue to all of us joining today for this first in a series of webinars sponsored by the Institute for Research in Public Policy entitled Emerging Shifts in Regulatory Governance. Again, my name is Rob Shepard and I'm a faculty member here in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. Before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge as the host institution for this webinar that Carleton University is located on the unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. In the spirit of Bimadzwin, let us hold this event in a good way that shows positive outcomes for all communities we serve. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Ditchburn, who is the President and CEO of the IRPP. She is also the sponsor of this series with schools of public policy and public administration across the country. Prior to joining the IRPP, Jennifer served as a journalist covering national and parliamentary affairs for the Canadian Press and for CBC Television. She has won various awards and has written on the history of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. I invite now Jennifer to offer her introductory remarks.
Thank you, Rob, and to the entire team at Carleton School of Public Policy and Administration, and to all of you who are watching today. This is an important day for us at the Institute for Research on Public Policy. It's the launch of several months of activities that will mark our organization's 50th anniversary, including this series of 9 events at universities across the country. The idea for the IRPP came about in a speech from the throne in 1968. The government of the time said it wanted an independent institute that could help it with long-term planning and to provide research that would help illuminate the choices that decision makers would have to make. In 1972, the IRPP was born. That idea of long-term planning and prioritization of choices is really at the heart of all 9 of these events. We asked each of the schools to choose a topic they felt deserved the attention of decision makers and the wider policy ecosystem. What we hear between now and October will also help us with our thinking around research that we might want to pursue at the IRPP. We hope that if you're a student or a public servant or a researcher or just a curious member of the public, that these events might help expand your knowledge and help you make sound decisions. I'm really looking forward to this conversation on regulatory governance, which Rob is going to set up for us. Rob?
Thanks, Jennifer, for those kind words of welcome to everyone. At this time, we would normally hear from our Director of the School of Public Policy and Administration, Professor Jennifer Stewart. However, Jennifer could not join us this afternoon as she is away. However, on her behalf, let me offer that the school is deeply honored to have been invited to join this webinar series spotlighting schools of public policy and public administration across the country. Such a series provides a glimpse into the range of research being carried out by CAPA member schools. It also highlights the degree of collaboration in research and teaching between and within our various units. Many thanks to the IRPP for their very generous invitation to participate. Next, I would like to take a few moments, so bear with me, to introduce the subject of our panel discussion for today, and then most importantly, to introduce our panel members. As a school, we decided to highlight research into various aspects of regulatory governance, as many faculty members are working on a number of questions that include reflections on this fundamental role of government, to make laws, and then to consider various ways in which such laws may be implemented, one of which is the use of regulation as an instrument. Governments will use regulation as a vehicle to create incentives, fill gaps such as competition or allocation of resources, level playing fields, or simply create conditions for greater fairness. In recent years, crisis events such as the Fort McMurray fires, the opioid crisis on the West Coast in particular, and most obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, among others, have forced governments to think differently about processes for crafting regulations in ways that respond fairly, ethically, and effectively to the problems they were intended to address. And for the most part, Canada has responded to these crisis events reasonably well. Canadians have tended to comply with governmental directives, but over the last number of years, transparency of process may not always have been a central consideration. In addition, governments have acted quickly to resolve problems, not always a bad thing, but sometimes with expediency over process. Likewise, governments may have acted slowly or provided affected groups, industries, or jurisdictions the space to decide on regulations in their own way, leading sometimes to disjointed responses between and among levels of government. As such, there have been calls by international organizations such as the OECD for governments to take a more principle-based versus rules-based approach to regulatory governance, meaning that the aims of regulation are clear to affected parties, thereby improving the likelihood that compliance will occur. They have also called for an ecosystem or multi-level approach to regulation in order to come to more coordinated, more balanced, and more innovative responses to increasingly complex policy problems. In the case of administrative regulation, for example, there have been calls by different levels of government to better coordinate on matters of privacy, such as the use of AI technology regulating the social media, lobbying, including regulating disclosure requirements, access to information, such as harmonizing what information can be accessed and when, and integrity, including areas of conflict of interest, whistleblowing, and setting codes of conduct. Several reviews across the country are occurring right now to improve understanding as to why such regulations are needed, what's their rationale, but more importantly, to better coordinate on regulatory requirements that impose compliance burdens on individuals and organizations across jurisdictions. Each of our panelists are experts in their areas of regulation, and they will discuss the inherent challenges and potential benefits of regulatory practice in their areas of focus. We will begin with Kevin Stringer, who is the director of the certificate program in regulatory leadership under the Regulatory Governance Initiative, an initiative that is managed jointly by Carleton University and the University of Ottawa. Kevin is a former senior public servant with many years of experience in matters of regulation in governments, who will be speaking about the shifts in regulatory practice, process, and implementation through his work with RGI. Next up will be Alex Mallett, who is associate professor with the School of Public Policy and Administration. Her work in sustainable energy and climate policy, low carbon technology cooperation, and science and tech policy is well known. She will be speaking about the challenges inherent in sustainable energy regulation and offer insights on where current practice is leading. Next, Catherine Mcquarrie and Chief Darcy Gray will be speaking about the conditions under which regulations affecting First Nations communities are carried out. Catherine Mcquarrie is a school fellow with SPPA and is also the project manager for the Rebuilding Indigenous Governments Project, a 7-year SHIRK partnership grant project being led by Professor Francis Abel and Satsan or Herb George with the University of Victoria. Darcy Gray is chief of the Listagouche First Nation and a graduate of the Indigenous Public Administration program at the school. His Mi'kmaq community is located on the southern shore of the Gaspé Peninsula. This is a joint presentation that highlights regulatory practice affecting First Nations in general and the best practices with regulatory governments in Listagouche. Following our panel presentations, which will be approximately 12 to 15 minutes each, we will have an opportunity for our Q&A session, at which point we invite each of you to participate. I now invite Kevin Stringer to give his comments. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, and really, really pleased to be here on this very important topic. So I'm going to offer, as was just said, some reflections on current and future trends in the regulation making space. There's some pretty broadly accepted principles and best practices for regulation making. Regulators know them well. They're probably best set out by the OECD in their principles that they set out in 2012, also reflected in the federal government's cabinet directive on regulation. And it includes a number of things that I think people would be familiar with. Transparency, things like effective engagement of the public, effective engagement of stakeholders and partners, accountability and regulatory oversight, taking an evidence-based approach, addressing silos and working effectively across governments, across departments, and internationally. Canada has added, in addition to the OECD principles, its own principles on top of that. Things like when you're doing and applying regulations, applying a diversity lens, ensuring that Section 35 consultations and accommodations are addressed, modern treaty is respected, and addressing a cumulative burden on industry and society more generally. So there's a good understanding of those principles and best practices. In the last 2 or 3 years, as Rob said, through some of the crises we've gone through, but in particular through the pandemic, those principles have come under incredible pressure as never before. I'm going to take a few minutes to reflect on how the pandemic in particular, but other crises have impacted regulators in Canada, what regulators have done about it, some thoughts about future debates, challenges, and opportunities that these derive going forward, and then some thoughts about what we might do to prepare for that future. So the pandemic's impacted the regulatory world in many, many ways. 3, I think, in particular that I just want to touch on. Number 1 has been, and this is the pandemic, but other crises as well, the need to respond quickly. The need to move in the regulatory space quickly is not something that is natural to regulators. Particularly if you think through those principles, effective engagement, full information, doing things in a stepwise way, dealing with other government departments, dealing with other governments, etc. All of these things take time. In a pandemic, and during the pandemic we've been in for the past 2 years, things like border measures, quarantine rules, mask and vaccine mandates, other public health measures, some by the federal government, some by provinces and territories, we've had to move extraordinarily quickly on them. But not just in terms of the public health emergency, also things like maintaining supply lines, addressing transportation corridors, making sure that those remain open, other critical infrastructure, making sure that those are left standing through the crisis. In some cases, what might take normally 18 months had to be done in 2 weeks, and in some cases, 2 days. Huge pressure on the application of those principles around coordination, whole of government approach, working with provinces and territories, addressing international standards, working with international partners. Engagement, it put huge pressure on public communications, engagement of key stakeholders. It put pressure on evidence-based decision-making and what type of risk we would take, having to take decisions quickly without full information. And it put pressure on the capacity within governments and civil society. We needed to focus our resources on all the on the urgent issues. So, number 1, the need to move quickly has put pressure on our key principles. Number 2, operating in a focused and hyper-engaged public environment. So regulators are used to working in a fairly rarefied environment, but in the last 2 years, everyone has been talking about the work of regulators and about the best practice principles. We had political leaders, we had health officials on our television sets talking about these principles, about an evidence-based approach, about peer-reviewed science, about risk management for vaccine and mask mandates, about compliance strategies for quarantine rules, about the role of independent advisors like NASTY, about inclusiveness and the differing impacts of some of the measures on Indigenous and other communities. Huge focus in the public on the work that regulators do. And our record on how we applied these principles and how we've been doing overall, subject of intense debate on news broadcasts, social media, at protests, demonstrations, and occupations, and at dinner tables and Zoom, family Zoom calls all across the country. So moving quickly and in a very public and highly charged environment. And third, operating in a virtual environment. Most have been working remotely. Most have not been able to work with their colleagues, directly with their ministers and cabinet ministers and parliamentarians, haven't been able to work with other governments directly, and with clients and key stakeholders. And in terms of meeting the reconciliation requirements and consultation requirements, huge challenges that particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. This has challenged the principle of engagement, transparency, coordination, and many other pieces. But it also challenges some of our principles around risk assessment, risk management, implementation, and compliance strategies. What happens to compliance principles when in-person inspections can't really take place or shouldn't take place? How do we operate with paper-based systems that require people to be in the same place going forward? So some real challenges to our principles, and I'll just touch quickly on how we have managed through it, how regulators have responded over the past couple of years. And I'll say 5 quick points. First, we've done a ton and we're still standing. A huge volume of regulations and orders from the federal government, provincial governments, territorial governments, local governments, indigenous governments, all working incredibly fast. And by the end of 2021, for example, federal government had issued 72 emergency orders under the Quarantine Act alone. All required a cabinet submission, all required work done to explain what it was about, and just a huge amount of work. Many of these were done with significant reductions in timelines. Emergency orders moved incredibly quickly. Vaccine approvals moved incredibly quickly in record times. And overall, Canada's had a pretty good record in terms of our regulatory work, but also in terms of our outcomes compared to many others. And finally, I'd say the critical infrastructure has been intact. So that's the first thing, a ton of work done, and we're still standing. The second thing is we have had to move to more flexibility than we've had, okay? And some forbearance. We've been getting through it, and some flexibility, as I say. Priority has necessarily been on the response to the pandemic. The emergency nature have meant that some initiatives have not proceeded as quickly as we might have hoped. Due diligence has been risk management. Those emergency orders, they do have explanatory notes associated with them, but they haven't been subject to, for example, a GBA plus assessment, strategic environmental assessment, cost-benefit analysis, the full engagement that we might normally have. They are time limited, however, so there is a requirement for a check-in. But more flexibility, and it speaks to what Rob was talking about at the beginning, principles-based approach, goals-based approach, and there has been more of that and less prescriptive regulations. Fact is that the emerging risks have changed so quickly, it's been difficult to stay on top of it. And so some flexibility has been in the system. Same thing with respect to assessment and monitoring and inspection. So where we couldn't be there in person, we've gone in some cases to more virtual inspections, to self-reporting with audit checks, and more monitoring overall. So some adjustment, some flexibility, and some flexibility going forward. The third thing is innovation. So we're still standing. We've had some flexibility and some forbearance, but we've had innovation to make it work. A huge investment in digitization, a huge investment in new technologies, in sensors. When we couldn't be together, when we needed to address paper-based system and move to a virtual system, when we needed to be able to do virtual inspections, a huge investment in digitization, something we've been talking about for a generation, but we've really amped up through the pandemic. Risk management frameworks have been assessed and renewed against virtual realities, and process innovations. When it came to the vaccines, the regular process was we had rolling submissions that took place in the vaccines, but it was done elsewhere as well. Rather than having the usual slower process of doing a stepwise approach, looking at the stakeholder engagement, followed by some assessments, followed by going to Canada Gazette 1, followed by talking to the enforcement people. Much of this was pulled together. Groups were pulled around the table, and there were process innovations to move more quickly and to have people at the table. So you're deciding at the front end whether this is enforceable. You're deciding at the front end the legal authorities around this. A lot of that made sense. So we're still standing, flexibility and some forbearance, innovation, and I would say the fourth thing, renewed relationships in governance. Partly because of our need, we needed one another more than ever in terms of responding to the pandemic and addressing the issues we always need to address. But we also had this investment in communications technology. We're on some of it right now. We've had it before, but it's much, much more broadly used. So within government, we have seen, I think, a greater use of a whole of government approach in the response to the pandemic. We didn't have the luxury of having to go stepwise. We've had everybody around the same table. Ditto with respect to the provinces and territories. There was constant communication. There has been constant communication and engagement with provinces and territories. We are getting better, I would posit, in terms of logistics, working with other levels of government, but also coordination with other levels of government. The same thing with respect to meeting international standards, but also keeping supply lines open, transportation systems open, financial systems afloat, et cetera. And working with stakeholders and the regulated. We've had to be very innovative there as well, and new relationships developed. And finally, with respect to the relationships, the relationship with the public and the regulated has changed, I would say, fundamentally. The importance of communications around regulation has been highlighted again and again. You know, the record on that, people can speak to it, but we've certainly had an engaged public, and I believe we will continue to have an engaged public. So those are some of the ways that we have responded. Some thoughts about the future directions in the regulatory world. Now, I will close on this. First, I don't think we're snapping back. I think most of these innovations, most of our renewed relationship, most of our communication technologies, I think where those are here to stay. I think that you know, digitization, the revolution on how a government engages stakeholders, the public, et cetera, the investment in communication technologies, et cetera. These are things that, frankly, we've been talking about for a generation, and we're really investing in now, and I think those things are here to stay. Second, I do think we need to look at the flexibilities. I think everybody, regulators, the public, the regulated, et cetera, need to look at some of those flexibility, the self-reporting, the adjustment of risk frameworks, the move towards inspections by virtual inspections. Much of it has worked. Much of it has been effective, but it is something we need to be thinking about versus some of the regulatory certainty and what the public expects from a regulatory regime. Third, I think the public will be our partners going forward on this. We have, as I said, had a very focused and engaged public. That is a good thing. Public scrutiny, you know, is always positive. We know there's all kinds of, there's a lot of stuff on social media that you would say, geez, a lot of disinformation here and there. But an engaged public at the end of the day is probably the best accountability system that we can hope for. So it invites more public reporting, more transparency, more effective use of data, more effective use of AI, virtual town halls, and new engagement strategies. And I think we'll see more of that going forward. Fourth, some of the fundamental issues that underlie our regulatory regime have been challenged. And I suspect we're going to see a public debate around a number of these things. Rob talked about privacy. I think that is going to be a significant issue going forward, talking about the public good, individual freedoms, what's in the realm of the individual, what's in the realm of the public, and how is privacy protected through all of this. And finally, through the entire process of the pandemic, some new trends. The process have really identified a number of areas where we need a focus on the regulatory world. Things like finance, crypto, AI, climate change, reconciliation, cybersecurity, other areas as well. There is a need for regulation, and all of those principles, those good principles need to be brought to bear in these areas that we need to further develop. And finally, I do think, apart from the sessions like this, we need to have, what have we learned through the pandemic? What do we want to keep? What do we want to adjust? What are the gaps going forward? So in sum, we know the best practices and principles and regulation. For the most part, we've been able to maintain those, but there's been some challenge as we've gone through the pandemic. Some of it has actually been reinforced. We've responded with flexibility, with innovation, with relationships, with people working extremely hard. And the system is showing some sign of stress as well, as people are tired. But it all points to an exciting and dynamic future, some really interesting issues as we go forward, and a public that is engaged in regulation's core business, which is something that is exciting and challenging, and something that we're going to have with us for a long time to come. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for those the four broad thematic areas that you've spoken to. I now turn attention to Alex, who will present next.
All right, excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess just to start off, I would like to thank the IRPP, and very pleased to be a part of this event, their first event in the IRPP event series, What Should Be on Canada's Policy Radar, Emerging Shifts in Regulatory Governance. And I also want to acknowledge too, as Rob noted, I'm actually speaking today from Carleton University, which is on the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. All right, so first to begin, I'm going to be talking about my experiences as a practitioner, a policy analyst and advisor, a teacher, and a researcher. And also through, I want to acknowledge discussions that I've had with colleagues and friends and family here in Ottawa, other parts of Canada, including Northern Canada, and those outside of Canada. I also want to say too that I come at this with two hats. So as Rob noted, a lot of my research and teaching has focused on sustainable energy policy, environment, climate policy, but also too in teaching public policy more generally. And I've also worked in the government. I used to work at Environment Canada back when it was just called Environment Canada and Natural Resources Canada. All right, so why are we talking about regulatory governance and the role of government? Now, the reason I say that is that I really want to be clear about scope, that basically what I'm talking about is with respect to public authorities and public policy. And I say this because, of course, there's this whole slew of information about private governance schemes, and it also plays a role in shaping these forces that we've been talking about. And what do I mean by that? It's governances by businesses or nonprofits. I remember Bob Slater, who was a founder of the Regulatory Governance Initiative that Kevin is involved with, and he worked for many years at Environment Canada. And what he told me about a decade ago is that when Walmart decided to green its supply chain, it effectively became the largest regulator in North America. Having said that, I'm going to not be talking about businesses. What I'm going to be talking about from the point of view of governments. So why are we talking about emerging shifts with respect to regulatory governance? Well, as Kevin and Rob both alluded to, there are seismic shifts in the world today, right? From everything to dealing with the climate crisis, the digitalization of society, upheaval in the global system. Kevin talked about the pandemic, rising inflation, supply chain disruptions, Russia's attack on Ukraine, etc. Basically, these shifts are changing how we think about, well, just about everything. And so when we think about governance, it's important to understand that what we really mean is how are we trying to manage these forces? And so one way is through regulation. So why are we talking about regulation? Well, again, if I can put on my public policy hat, there are various tools in the policymaker's toolbox. So you may have heard the term carrots, sticks, and sermons. So why regulate? Well, in the energy and environmental realm, it actually can be the most effective. Mainly, it can achieve the policy goal. To give one example, despite all the hype about carbon taxes or political concerns about carbon taxes, actually Ontario's phase out of coal has been one of the key ways that Ontario has reduced greenhouse gas emissions. It's important to note, though, that some distinctions about the coal phase out in Ontario. Number one, the original key driver was to do with air quality. Sure, greenhouse gas emissions reductions was a goal, but at the end of the day, the key goal was to do with reducing the smog days in the GTA. This is not to say that effectiveness is the only criteria, as Rob and Kevin pointed out. There are a number of other issues, including ethical issues, etc., fairness, distributional effects, and political considerations. So for instance, let's go back to Ontario's coal phase out that I was talking about. So one reason why it was quote unquote successful in terms of increasing air quality and reducing greenhouse gas emissions is that what we call in political science, there were no large vested interests in place, meaning that there were no coal mines in Ontario. And in terms of the people who worked at the coal-fired plants in Ontario, which were distributed throughout the province, there were only about 770 of them back in 2003. So what do we talk about? We talk about the importance of a policy window. So in the early 2000s, smog days in the GTA, that was on the media interest. People were talking about it. There was a health issues report by the Canadian Medical Association, etc. Now, the other interesting thing, because of course, Kevin has been talking about these major short-term crises, but the interesting thing with the Ontario example is actually it was done over time. So the commitment started when the Liberals were elected in 2003. They made it clear that this was important to them. There was a law passed in 2007, and that law actually stated that the end of coal phase out would occur by the end of 2014. And there was another act in 2015 that required Ontario not to turn to coal for future electricity generation. All right, so what's the problem? Well, as Rob was talking about, and Kevin as well, a key agency that looks at regulatory governance is the OECD. And they put together an important paper that talks about some of the key deficits with respect to regulation. These ones include oversight, participation, incentives, and adaptability. Now, I would add a fifth, and that is the need for clear overarching goals of government, and then aligning your policy, including regulation, to these goals, what we call in the policy world, policy coherency. So just to give an example, as I said before, I worked a lot on sustainability, decarbonization, and these are key priorities of the current federal government. And not only the federal government, provincial government, territorial governments, Indigenous governments, etc. And so if governments are serious about these goals, then they need to ensure that the regulations are aligned. All right, so let's go back to what I was talking about with respect to the deficits. The first one is a really important one, and it speaks to the oversight deficit. So thinking about the coal phase out in Ontario, yes, true, it was done over time, but there was a problem. There were major rising electricity costs in Ontario. And this speaks to the importance of independent bodies or the legislature. So in this case, in 2015, due to the rising electricity costs, there was media interest. For instance, Global News was profiling stories of families that couldn't use their electricity, they couldn't do this and that and that. And then through, I know Rob was talking about the access to information legislation. And so through that, the media found out that there were more than 500,000 customers were behind on their bills, for instance. And 6 60,000 households in the province had been cut off from their hydro services in 2015. So, as a response to that, enter the Protection of Vulnerable Energy Customers Act. It received unanimous consent from all political parties, and it was passed in November 2017. So through that law, now basically people cannot be disconnected in Ontario for non-payment from November 15th to April 30th. And electricity distributors may not install load control devices, which limit how much electricity is supplied to a home, also in that same period. Now, what do I mean by load limiters? Basically, for those who are not familiar with this, it's a small device placed on an electricity meter to reduce the amount of electricity being used at one time. So for instance, you may be able, if you're lucky, to use an air fryer or a toaster oven one at a time, but you can't use the stove, the dryer, or the dishwasher. Interestingly enough, this issue continues to be on the media radar, where I saw a story yesterday about load limiters in Calgary, where a woman wouldn't wish this on her worst enemy as the prices of electricity are increasing there. Now let's turn to electricity use by residents in Northwest Territories. So in the pandemic, in March 2020, the electricity utility said, all right, well, because of the pandemic, it's going to remove all limiters and pause collection on overdue accounts. Then 8 months later, it says, hold on a second here, we are actually in arrears by $2 million. And so we actually need to resume collections. And so the problem with this has really created a lot of hardship for a number of families in Northwest Territories. So for instance, you have stories of elders boiling water on propane stoves and pouring under pipes so that they don't freeze, etc. Now in NWT, there is actually a draft law, Bill 23, which is an act to amend the Public Utilities Act. So the question becomes, all right, so if we can think about big picture, what do we do in terms of moving forward? I think it's really important to think about if our conventional criteria, conventional metrics for criteria in terms of, how to regulate, if they're missing the mark, maybe we should revisit them. And in this time, I think it's important to think about equity. And so basically that ensuring regulations don't place an undue burden on people. We did this in Ontario through legislation. Why can't we do this elsewhere in Canada? All right. Second note is the participation deficit. And so here I'll speak about the Green Energy and Green Economy Act in 2009. So that was one way in which to spur renewable energy use in Ontario to help with the phase out of coal. The problem with this, though, is that it exempted these projects from the Planning Act, where municipalities would have a say on proposed development. So for large renewable energy projects, suddenly people in rural Ontario saw wind and solar farms going up and having little to no power to stop this from happening. And so unfortunately in Ontario, in the 2010s, renewable energy ended up becoming a political wedge issue and led to Ford's Green Energy Repeal Act of 2018, which got rid of the exemptions for the renewable energy projects from the Planning Act. So some of my colleagues would say, well, climate change is too important an issue to let local naysayers from rural Ontario stop these things. I'd actually disagree, and this is someone who's been working on sustainable energy for over 20 years. The same thing with conventional energy sources, and this speaks to the importance of process, something that is called in the literature procedural justice. And so what I would say here in terms of moving forward with respect to that, it's important to think about an appropriate balance between wanting to move quickly while also being mindful and respectful. Now, the other two, the incentive and adaptability deficits, I know Kevin talked about them, but basically the idea here is either this discourages opportunity for innovation and adaptability too uniform and lacking diversity. So here I would echo Kevin's points about the importance about flexibility and innovation. But to finish off my talk, I guess I want to talk about the last thing that I was saying, and that is the importance of linking regulatory efforts to your larger goals or the need for policy coherency. All right, so we know that there's a budget coming out soon. Of course, I don't have any intel or interesting intel, but I did notice in an article in late January, the federal government signaled that the upcoming budget will be about jobs and growth and affordability and ways to make Canada more competitive and innovative, and funds to help transition to a green economy. All right, so given the recent events in Ottawa and elsewhere with the truckers' convoys, I would proffer that these priorities need to be thought of in ways that unite rather than divide Canadians. In fact, Freeland noted back in late January the importance of the budget ensuring prosperity for all of Canada's people. Of course, in Ukraine, we may be thinking about rethinking about security, armed forces renewal, countering disinformation, the goals of reconciliation, etc. But I'm going to turn to sustainability and addressing climate change. And let me give you an example. Okay, so in thinking about sustainability, transitions, and climate change, one goal is the federal government's goal of to have an economy-wide net zero goal by 2050. To their credit, Environment and Climate Change Canada put together a recent discussion paper on the proposed clean electricity standard. And right away, this paper acknowledged this overarching goals and puts forth a number of questions to the public about how to design the clean electricity standard. This is a really good start. But the federal government needs to do this more comprehensively. For instance, the paper or the scope of the paper is focusing on electricity generation. But what about the whole life cycle of goods and services involved in electricity and throughout the economy, such as heavy industry? And it's also important to keep in mind other goals beyond greenhouse gas emission reductions, such as sustainability and reconciliation. This goes beyond regulations. For instance, Ontario 2, the independent electricity system operator. Okay, so while recently they're looking at a scenario envisioning a moratorium on natural gas, actually their current projections are based on natural gas serving as 25% of Ontario's electricity mix in 2040. So in thinking about how that goal might be aligned to Canada's target for net zero, this seems to be missing the mark. So I leave you with this. Number one, if we really want to move forward, the importance of looking at alternative criteria, in particular equity. Number two, a balance between, there's a tension in regulation in terms of being fast and nimble, while at the same time being reflexive. So you may have heard of the book Common Thinking, Fast and Slow. I guess I would say regulating fast and slow. And finally, the thing that I think is most important is to take a step back, and as Kevin talks about taking this whole regulatory ecosystem and ensuring that what you're doing for regulation is aligned with your overarching goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex, for those interesting comments, particularly the way you ended on equity, nimbleness, and the ecosystem. I'll now turn to Catherine and Chief Darcy Gray for their comments.
Thanks very much, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. I'm coming to you from Ottawa today. I'm just going to speak very briefly to give some context to Chief Darcy's remarks, because he's got a very interesting story to tell about where reconciliation can be achieved. Both Kevin and Alexander have talked about reconciliation as an important policy goal in the field of regulations. So as Rob mentioned, I'm a project manager with the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. We're a national partnership of 6 First Nation communities, 2 tribal councils, 6 Canadian universities, 3 non-government organizations, and 35 academics, researchers, and practitioners right across the country. And we came together to support our partner First Nation communities as they've made the decision to transition from being under Indian Act governance to exercising their own inherent right to self-government. And all of this project is supported by a SHRC partnership grant. And in our case, the First Nations communities we're working with are either already implementing or drafting their own laws and regulations to exercise their inherent rights. And they're doing this in any number of jurisdictions, notably in our communities. Child and Family Services is a big one. as is land and resource management, including for things, specific areas of endeavor like fisheries and forestry. And their work also includes not just drafting and implementing their own laws and regulations, but ultimately reaching rights recognition and coordination agreements with other orders of government where jurisdiction overlaps or comes into conflict. So Chief Gray is going to talk about, with much more authority than me, on what it is actually like to live through that experience. But before I turn it over to him, I wanted to look at it from the federal, provincial, and territorial government side for a moment, because there are important considerations, as has already been mentioned, for how you do your work in engaging with Indigenous governments. There are significant considerations, in fact, for government analysts and policymakers who are developing and applying regs that implicate Aboriginal rights. And of course, it goes far beyond the notion of stakeholder engagement. And it is certainly, I think, takes us beyond what has been kind of the traditional practice in government around applying the duty to consult and accommodate. Probably many of you are going, this is additional complications leading to less efficient processes, but I would argue that done well and be based on an approach that is about relationship building, that it can actually lead to greater efficiency in our regulatory system. So, as you know, Canada, and by extension, the provinces and territories, have statutory, contractual, and common law obligations to consult with Aboriginal groups on issues affecting them and their rights, and accommodate their rights and their interests if need be. And this is an obligation that can't be delegated to proponents. The requirements for how you do this have been built up in case law over time, either due to courts confirming the existence of rights or the failure of governments to adequately address those rights in their conduct. Another factor, and this is a relatively new one that you need to consider, is in the way you do your work, is the implementation of Canada's UNDRIP Implementation Act, which, among other things, will include measures to ensure the consistency of federal laws and presumably regulations with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So I think, for more effective and efficient regulatory governance, we need to get away from sort of one-off, high-stakes interactions around these issues that inevitably lead to drawn-out disputes, to more regular and reciprocal relationships around the development and application of regulations, and to an openness to accommodate Aboriginal rights and interests, and even various Canadian guidelines for duty to consult support this notion of reconciliation and relationship building at the same time. That it will strengthen, do a better job of integrating regulations, and lead to more timely decision making. As well, of course, one of the goals of regulation, good regulation, is promoting economic benefits to all Canadians. So with that, I think, when you can reach this level of inclusion in the way that you approach development and implementation of regulations, that's when you start getting into real reconciliation between Canada's Indigenous peoples, or Indigenous peoples in Canada, and other orders of government, and it will be a boon for everyone. And with that, I'll turn it over to Darcy to talk about many decades of experience working in his community.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you very much for the invite to participate in this today. It's a tremendous honor to be joining the other panelists and be part of this. So what I'm here to share today is a little bit about our history and the work that we've done here in Stewart, developing our laws around fisheries. So I guess as the jumping off point, it's important to know that back in '81, a significant event here that shaped I guess at that point the future, or now our history here in Stewart, where we had hundreds of police officers raid our community, were violent towards our community members, all in a dispute around fisheries, specifically salmon fishery. We have one of the most beautiful salmon rivers in the world. It's world renowned. And we've been living here in this area for tens of thousands of years, taking good care and being stewards of that river and that resource. Our relationship with the salmon is very important. So in and around 93 to 95, our community responded by developing our own Rangers Law and salmon fishing law, our own fishing law, to manage the river, to oversee the management plans, the way we would approach fishing in the river, and continuing our salmon fishery in a sustainable way, in a way that matches up with our values, our beliefs, who we are as a people, and protecting not just the river, but also the salmon in that river. We've been doing it since. We've developed a lot of capacity around that. We've been able to learn from our mistakes, review and adjust and adapt. And we've had now, looking at when we started to where we are now, people have made entire careers, either doing the scientific research on the river, enforcing or encouraging compliance, and also out there fishing and providing for their families. So it's a beautiful history we have, resultant from a rather unfortunate and, I would say, impactful event, negatively impactful, but we've certainly learned from that and grown from that. My experience is a little more recent as chief. I've been chief for almost 6 years now in the community, but in and around 2017, we started looking at how would we expand our law, not just around salmon, but into lobster fishery. We, talking about some of the other things that I think it was Kevin Stringer spoke about, the importance of engagement and transparency. We engaged in 2 years of community engagement. We went around and basically engaged in consensus building in and around what a lobster fishery would look like for Listuguj by Listuguj. Out of those engagements, we were able to focus in on 4 principles. It would be unkodamuk, which is taking care of something, looking out for. It's assuming that responsibility for ourselves in relation to our relationship with the lobster. Abhijiginmuin, which is sharing, giving back. So anybody that and even myself growing up, we were always taught that your first catch is not for you, it's for somebody else. You have to give that away. So we wanted to make sure that was incorporated into our eventual salmon law that we were developing. Then we have Get Me Datum and Edge, which is about respect for all relations, respect for the knowledge that people bring, whether that be traditional knowledge, ecological knowledge, scientific knowledge, and harmonizing that and making sure that we're going forward in a good way and in a respectful way for everyone. And then Weltdadamic, which is agreeing in thought and that consensus building. And that's not just about our own view as Indigenous, as Listuguj Mi'kmaq, but the world around us, the people around us, ensuring that there's education, sharing that's going on. And those have been the guiding principles in our law throughout. They've helped with the development of our lobster fishing plans that we do every year. We've implemented the law in 2019, where our community went out and fished with our own lobster tags on the traps. We again look out and take care of the enforcement of the compliance aspect, encouraging people to go out and do things in a good way, in a safe way. And we also do a lot of dockside monitoring. So ensuring that when the catch, when our fishers come back to the community or come back to the docks, that giving back to the community is done, that our elders are taken care of, that families are being fed. And it's not just about, say, the economic opportunity for the fishers, but it is really about the community and feeding the community members. So we've been doing that for a few years now, and we've continued to evolve, continue to amend and review the way we do this, the practices that we have, and I think we continue to get better and better. I would say it was not necessarily welcomed with open arms by all other stakeholders. We did have some issue to work through with DFO on how to go about this. I would say the relationship with DFO or the conflictual relationship with DFO, extends beyond my life. It's all I had ever heard of basically growing up. But I'm happy to say that, in April of 2021, we were able to reach a collaboration agreement of sorts and a rights reconciliation agreement. And this has, getting to that agreement, developing a common understanding, the importance of our values, the importance of our principles, and building off of those key concepts that we can agree on, such as conservation and the importance of protecting the species, and realizing that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do, as well as take care of our family. I think we can all connect with that importance of being able to take care of our communities. We also acknowledge that we've looted from a lot of these fisheries over the years, and in the last 20 years or so, Indigenous communities, Stewart being no different, have started to find that space again, but not just getting into the harvesting, but also wanting to be involved in the decision making and the management. How do we go about harvesting resources or engaging in those fisheries in a good way? So the agreement, I think it's a wonderful step forward. I think it's forward thinking. It's innovation in action that was referenced earlier. We look at, DFO recognizes that we do have that authority, that we do have a law, that it is our responsibility to uphold that law. We do talk about the application, the enacting of that law, the operationalization of it. We understand that there is that duty to consult aspect. However, we're not just talking about sort of the duty to consult, and I would say the endless letters that get sent to us that are oftentimes, I would say, menial and quite time consuming without much I would say bang for your buck, and so to speak. But instead we've created tables where we can engage in operational conversations, ways to collaborate and better understand each other. And so when you're actually out on the field, when you're actually enacting the law or going out and fishing, we're doing it in a way that we can both agree upon. And if there are issues, we have ways to bring those forward, mechanisms to deal with that. We also have an executive oversight committee where for years we had been at a stalemate or loggerheads, just unable to move past certain difficulties. But by establishing this executive oversight committee and having the opportunity to talk face to face and regularly and keying in on some of those issues, we've been able to move past some really difficult obstacles in very short order. And we've seen a lot of progress. Mind you, we're by no means done. I would say that we're very much at the start of things with a hope for much more in the future. If I could share what hasn't worked, I would say it was the denial of our rights, saying that we can't fish. In any of those efforts, I would say that has not worked, and it has not resulted in a good regulatory regime, if you will. Our fishing efforts should only be used in a certain way. When you fish, it's either for food or to sell, but it can't be one or it can't be both. I think that's I understand that has been how license conditions have been issued in the past. For us, it's important to understand that when we're out harvesting or fishing, it is to provide for our family one way or the other. Either it's something that we feed our family with directly, or it's something that we'll exchange to earn a livelihood so that we can still support our family. And what is working or what are we learning about is that we still need to build on the trust. We still need to work on that aspect. I would say that the trust in ourselves and the trust in our own community that we can do this, that we have the capacity, despite a long history of demonstrating that we can enact our law, we can do so in a good way. There is still building up that community trust, as well as trust with our partners, our collaborators, our neighbors, that we ensure that things are done in a good way. And I think more importantly is that the status quo or the alternative to the status quo is worth exploring and working on. And I think that's probably the most important lesson that we've learned, is that just because it's been done this way for so long doesn't mean it have to stay that way. And if we're open to dialogue and collaboration, I think we can come up with some really interesting results. And I would say here in this regard, living it, being a part of it, watching it grow and develop, I think we can be a lot more flexible, a lot more responsive in terms of our regulatory approach and the way we're doing things. So I think it creates more of a win-win type scenario. And in the end, you have improved compliance and understanding. And I guess I would end it there and just thank everyone for the opportunity to share a little bit of our story. There's a lot more I could share. I'm trying to kind of keep it focused and short, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chief Gray and Catherine, for your comments. I would invite all of our panelists to turn on their cameras and mics, and I would also invite all of us present, if you do have a question, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to register a question there, and we will put that in the queue. I guess to get us, and there are some questions in the queue already, so I will just get some perspectives from our panelists on a few of the questions that we have. Keith, for example, asks the question, since the pandemic began, obviously the number of regulations or the focus of regulations perhaps has been primarily on health, as one would expect, which leaves a rather large gap in other departments carrying out their regulatory programs. So the question he's asking is, does the federal government have the ability and capacity to actually catch up? And where would we place, I would ask, in addition to his question, where else would you consider placing priority for the federal government at the moment? Or indeed other governments? Maybe Kevin, you can get us started.
Sure, I'm happy to start. It's a good question, very good question. One of the things that I did say is that there has been a focus on the response to the pandemic in terms of the regulatory efforts by the federal government, and I think it's probably this case for provinces and territories. I do worry about capacity and capacity of regulators and those that are regulated. But I worry about, I said a little bit at the end that we've done, we've come through is too strong a word. We're still in the pandemic. We've been managing, et cetera, but there are signs of stress. And the people, I think, are exhausted. You hear crazy stories about people that haven't had a weekend for a year and a half. People that I talked to an ADM who had her team working on Labor Day weekend, 16 hours each of the 3 days. And she says, you think I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. So there are stories like that. And so worry about that. And I agree that there is likely a backlog of things that we should be moving on. I talked to some of those things that, it's evident that we need a more regulatory strength on. Things like AI, things like finance and crypto, things like climate change. Some of the, Catherine and Darcy talked about, it's not just about reconciliation and consultation, co-development. And we've seen co-development initiatives happening in some areas, but we need to see more in terms of government. So capacity is needed for all of those things. There will be a catch-up period, I think. I do worry about it. We have good people, we have experts, we have good training for them as well. But it is something to watch very carefully, and in particular, to make sure that people are getting the recovery opportunities that they need to be effective going forward.
Thanks, Kevin. Anybody else wish to?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to jump in. I don't necessarily have an answer, but what I do want to say is that if we don't, or if the federal government, any government doesn't, someone else will. What do I mean by that? I don't know how many times I look in The Economist talking about, ads from Facebook or, Tesla and Elon Musk doing this and that. And so at the end of the day, governments have the they're public authorities, and so they're driven beyond profit maximization, right? And so they have the long-term vision. You know, despite the typical narrative of governments as being clunky and slow and reactive, we can actually see that governments can move really quickly. Again, look at all the responses in the pandemic and what have you. But I think what will be important for government is to take that balance between, all right, what's a short-term crisis that we need to move fast on right now, and what is on the horizon, and what do we need to be thinking about proactively, right? As Kevin mentioned, you know, things like artificial intelligence, social media, disinformation, and of course, you know, the climate crisis. So this is where government has to say, okay, if they're really serious about it, and it's important to develop internal capacity, well, look at the Regulatory Governance Initiative, and how can we entice and train a younger new set of regulators.
Thank you. Anyone else can move forward? Okay, so there's another set of questions. A few people have asked this question. Maybe this is appropriate just to combine them. There's been some concern that Canada's been a little self-congratulatory moving to a digital-based regulatory system in 2020, whereas other countries have done this some time ago. So how can we, or how have the fundamental principles of risk assessment and people-centered policymaking changed, if at all? And I'm assuming part of the answer is, how do we take better advantage of digital technology? And I'll put that in the Indigenous context too. How can we better support Indigenous communities and the like as well?
Well, I can start if you want. Just to first of all agree with the premise of the question. You know, for about a generation, we have been talking in all governments in Canada about digitization, about remote work, about finding new ways to work together, finding new ways to communicate, about all those things. And we actually had made progress before the pandemic, no question, but it's really amped up. But I agree with the premise of the question that, geez, you know, it would have been better to have been there already. And certainly our rhetoric was making noise like that. Same with remote work. That said, all the work that we had done on digitization, on communications technology, actually enabled us to be successful if we hadn't made those investments. But there was a lot of catch up, and I think it's a really, really good point. I think there's all kinds of ways, and it does relate a little bit to capacity, about how we can take advantage of it and leverage it. You know, we are seeing, I hear from regulators that our inspection processes have moved, some of them, away from in-person inspection, but have got monitoring systems, using digitization, using you know, electronic monitors, all those types of things. We need to do an assessment about, you know, how that's doing, but there are things that I think can help us address the capacity issue. One of the things I worry about is, you know, we are financially, as all governments have spent a fair amount of money in the last couple of years. And so we need to protect, I think, capacity in this regulatory world, but digitization is going to help us there. And we need to do an assessment of, I think, of that as well.
So can I jump in? I guess I wanted to absolutely agree. I absolutely agree, because I got to tell you that, you know, for researchers, right, data information, it's our bread and butter of how to do research, right? And so I actually want to give credit and a shout out to Jennifer Ditchburn and to the media, right, for their tenacity in terms of access to information and getting information to the public. And at the end of the day, it goes to what I was saying earlier about the importance of having overarching goals and making the regulations work for them. So good grief, the government's been talking for years about open data, open government. My colleague Amanda Clark, she recently wrote to something, I think, for IRPP on this very issue in terms of the importance of digitalization and government. On the other hand, in thinking of the role of government in changing behaviors and norms and what have you, I point to the story about the diplomatic tiff between Russia and Canada, where basically the UN mission to Canada, or the Canadian mission to the UN, basically posted on Twitter their comments on, a note between about Russia with respect to the situation in Ukraine. And the question becomes, to me, it's like, does that really need to be on Twitter? If Canada already wasn't on Putin's crosshairs, maybe that might do it. And so I totally agree that in terms of, like, at the end of the day, if we're moving to a digital society, government needs to move along there kicking and screaming. On the other hand, just in thinking of that moving fast and slow with respect to regulation, it's important to have set up some boundaries.
Rob, thanks for raising that there is, in fact, an Indigenous angle to this, because I think, and I know Darcy will have absolutely concrete examples of this, but most Indigenous communities are on Zoom too. We've done the first 2 years of our project virtually with all the communities that we're working with, and I think what it provides is, now the governments are far more used to using face-to-face digital technology, is a real opportunity to get beyond the one-off superficial engagements and actually do relationship building. I think, because many of our communities are in kind of the nether regions of Canada that people don't tend to travel to regularly, we have tended to ignore Indigenous relationships and communities because of that distance. Well, there's no excuse anymore. You can't replace the importance of face-to-face for relationship building, but once you've got kind of those basic relationships established, the opportunities to have much greater engagement on a regular basis is now available through technologies like this. And Darcy, I think you were telling me that not that long ago that part of your interaction now with governments has been aided by being able to meet more regularly via Zoom.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in the negotiation of the RRA, that was almost entirely done virtually. I would say what was interesting for us, and I don't know, I don't think it would be unique, but just having to travel all the time, you lose a lot of time in transit to these important meetings, where instead now you send a call, and 2 minutes later you're connected and you're exchanging information. And a lot of times you can share documents, you can collaborate, you can work together, you can pull in other communities. So moving into that digitization, I think was phenomenal in terms of being able to connect with the people we needed to. The other side of it, though, is that you don't have much time to process in between these meetings. You're just moving from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting. The downside for if I could speak a little bit to the capacity, is that as First Nation communities, it's a double-edged sword where because a lot of times it seemed when program funding would come in, you'd start getting a nice rhythm going. The program would end, the funding would end, and you'd have to you couldn't hang on to good people, and a lot of these good people would move away for better opportunity in other places. But through remote working, remote opportunities, we are seeing people that live away wanting to come back and work for the community because they don't actually have to move. They can actually stay where they are and contribute and help. And I think that's been one of our difficulties in the past, is recruiting young talent, new talent, or maybe some experienced talent that have set up shop in urban areas, but now have that opportunity to come and work for us. So I think we've seen some interesting, downside, but also some interesting upside to where things are going in terms of capacity development.
I was gonna say it's an interesting conversation, because I was thinking during all your comments that, and I've been wondering whether there'll be an assessment within government about whether, broadly speaking, regulatory consultation processes, whether we've flattened sort of a hierarchy within those consultations. So not just with Indigenous communities and nations, but with all kinds of marginalized groups, whether they're finding it easier to access regulatory process because they're happening online. I was thinking about an article I read last week or a couple of weeks ago about a major science conference in the US where they found that exponentially more women scientists were attending because they didn't have to attending online because they didn't have to contend with childcare impediments and so on. So I wonder if there'll be an assessment of that, whether it will continue. And in addition to that, we're talking about remote work, which the federal government is dealing with right now, how each department is deciding individually how they're going to deal with remote workers. But what is the impact of that from a regulatory perspective in terms of having a broader access to people from all over Canada, and not just in the National Capital Region, to participate in the actual regulatory process? So you can, live in Red Deer, and you can live in, in New Brunswick, or you can live in Yukon and still be part of the federal government. I don't think we're even started to assess those things because we're still in the pandemic, but I think that the implications are going to be really far-reaching. At some point, we'll be able to assess that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we haven't assessed it, but we sure are talking about it, Jennifer. It's a really, really good point. And I think, for all the reasons that Chief Gray spoke to in terms of capacity and that you spoke to, people are already using that as a tool in terms of recruitment. And the idea of, diversity comes in many fashions and ways. Part of it is location diversity, and outside of Ottawa diversity. It actually makes a positive difference. So I think that is going to make a difference in terms of capacity. At the same time, we're all going to be competing with one another. But, that assessment, I would say, does need to be done, has not been done, but everybody's aware of what you said.
This is a nice segue into a few questions, but I'll ask Jillian's question, where she's saying, do you think that because of the complexity of our systems, it would be better to move as many aspects of governance closer to the people, moving systems to the municipal and provincial level instead of nationalizing more services? So it kind of gets to the point you just made, Kevin, but it also seems to me it gets to a larger point on a less antagonistic or adversarial system and getting us closer to this ecosystem type of approach the OEC is referring to. And within the Indigenous context, removing barriers and creating space. So it's almost like a federal question that's being asked as well. So I was wondering if anybody had some thoughts just on this, both the subsidiarity idea, but how do we get closer to this ecosystem type of approach?
If I can jump in here, I think it's a really important point. And if you think of some of the criticisms of Ottawa, it's often that it's, away from, many people who live here or in Canada's lives, right? And so, this is where I'll go back to my experience with respect to climate change. And I think both are needed. So for instance, on the one hand, let's go to the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, right? And so some people are like, oh, well, it's just a bunch of people, they fly there and they make these commitments and yada, yada. But if you actually really want to look at where climate action is happening, this is where you look to, the cities, Indigenous groups. I'm thinking of Old Crow, for instance, in Yukon. They were the first entity to declare a climate emergency in that place, and then the territorial government followed them. On the other hand, without that sort of high-level commitment, it kind of speaks to, all right, well, what is our overarching goal and are we working toward it? And so by virtue of the Canadian government signaling, all right, we want an economy-wide net zero goal by 2050, it kind of forces, small communities. I grew up in Northern Ontario, speaking of being creatures of experiences. And so, small communities like New Liskeard, Ontario to, Kingston, et cetera, sort of taking a step back and saying, okay, this is actually important, and how do we move there? So I definitely see both.
Let me just jump on that. I agree. And I think it depends on the issue. And some things I think do would do better at the local level, and some things are more national and some are more federal provincial. I just reflect a little bit on what we've been coming through in the pandemic process and the response to the pandemic and the health orders by different provinces. It's been extremely interesting to see what different provinces and territories have done, and what some municipalities have done, and what some Indigenous communities have done. I think, we've been able to sort of almost pick and choose, geez, that worked really well. And in some cases, it made sense because of the local, what was happening in that province or territory or Indigenous community. So, but not everybody else had to have the same restrictions. So there is some benefit to seeing all that. On the other hand, if you live in a place like Ottawa and you're crossing the border to Quebec and Ontario on a regular basis, there's different rules on different sides. People were confused about the rules. So there's pluses and negatives. I think overall it's positive, but there are some things that really do merit a local responses to things. One final thing on this. If there's one thing, another thing that we've learned is about the interconnectedness of, let's say, the supply lines, okay, and how Canada is fundamentally dependent on the rest of the world. Borders take on a different subtleness, I would say, with what we've seen in the past couple of years. So we need to think hard about what is the role for national government, a provincial government, an Indigenous government, local community, et cetera.
Yeah, if I could just jump in some of our experiences, I would say, and perhaps it's unique, but to me, the local aspect is so important, and being able to develop some of that, the regulatory regimes, and I'll use actually the pandemic as a bit of a sore spot, and for us personally in Listuguj, and a good learning opportunity. If you don't know where Listuguj is, we border Quebec, New Brunswick. So as Kevin Stringer was talking about, different provinces having different regimes. Well, New Brunswick's regime at one point was to deny access to everybody that is not New Brunswick, New Brunswickers. So imagine living in Gatineau, but doing all of your shopping and going to school in Ottawa, and being told you can't go there. Sorry, you can't go buy socks, you can't buy groceries, you can't buy underwear. Those are not essential. Go find some other place to do it. So our community members were stuck, taking 40-minute drives rather than crossing the bridge. And in the middle of a pandemic where you cannot really ask, I always think of, not a big deal for me. I mean, I do have a vehicle, I have a wife, I have, a couple of older children can kind of help out with, at the home. But if you're a single parent living on limited means, and the height of the pandemic, you've got nobody that's going to look after your kid, because you're not supposed to, right? You're not supposed to mix bubbles. So how do you take a 40-minute cab ride down the road to go get your groceries, leaving your child at home, or do you haul them with you? So you're caught between these impossible regulations. And that was one of the battles that we had, and had to take up in trying to find this local solution to a decision made by other entities, political entities, living 5 hours away from us and protecting, I would say, more their centers rather than their distant borders that we happen to live on. So definitely our own experience has taught us that, local options are sometimes the best. I can understand that, that perhaps provincial and federal regulations are important. But I think that local flexibility to be able to find solutions that work for you are essential, and incorporating the people in that. I mean, the pandemic exposed that for us, and in all honesty, we're still recovering from the damages here locally that were created by these regimes imposed on us, and it's not the local people that created it, but we are unique and trying to recover.
Darcy, I just wanted to ask you about that. Is that more of a reflection of a breakdown in the federation, or our view of intergovernmental affairs? If, the province obviously, didn't see, there's local, but there's also an Indigenous level of government there. And if anything, the pandemic probably exposed where the federation is all our weak spots. But I wonder if you know, if maybe the provinces had viewed Alistagouche in a different way, and instead of just as a you know, a local community to deal with, it might have turned out in a different way.
And you need to answer that, Darcy, in 20 seconds.
In 20 seconds. Well, let's say it was a huge learning opportunity for everybody involved. You know, in especially, I would say, the New Brunswick government, in just how interconnected we are, despite living on what they would consider the Quebec side of the river. So, and you know, we have to rebuild those relationships and those connections, and understand, you know, that, I mean, we spend, you know, over $50 million a year in the city of Campbellton, and we don't spend that on the Quebec side. So, I mean, you know, that's got to count for something, if you consider economy important.
That's a good place to end. So great discussion, and the key theme that I think has come out of this entire discussion is we know that regulation is shifting from this technocratic rules-based exercise to one that's increasingly agency-based. And I think that's a key takeaway. So what does that actually mean in practice for communications, for digital technology, for federalism? These are big questions that are going to take time to address. So I want to thank each of our panelists for each of their insights. Kevin Stringer, Alex Mallett, Catherine Mcquarrie, and Chief Darcy Gray, for all of your generosity of time and your insights. With that, I will turn it back to Jennifer for final comments.
Thank you. Yes, thank you to the panel. It was a great discussion, and to everyone who tuned in, to the team at the IRPP, and also to our co-hosts at Carleton. Thank you so much. Please visit the IRPP's website for more information on our upcoming events. There are opportunities to attend in person as well. I know that's a bit odd, but we are doing hybrid events for the next 8 events. Our next conversation will take place at Université Laval on Thursday at noon on the topic of inclusive governance and democracy. Cette discussion sera en français et vous pourrez participer en ligne ou en personne à l'université. So I welcome everybody to come if they're in Quebec City on Thursday, or you can tune in online as you have today. Thank you, and hope to see you again.